This week has been a really awful week to be a farmer in Britain.
Good evening. Farmers across the Thames Valley say they fear for the future and small family farming is at risk following the budget.
Yesterday, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, announced changes to the way inheritance tax will be applied to farms with more than £1 million of assets in what's being described as a potentially killer blow for British farming.
Well, Kieran Fitzpatrick has been speaking to one farmer in Oxfordshire who says he may have to sell up.
That'll do, girls, just there.
Farming is in James Florey's DNA. They've grown crops, reared sheep and cattle on his land in Northmoor near Oxford for over a century.
So how many generations of your family have been on this farm?
So I'm the fourth generation of my family to be farming here, so very fortunate in that respect. A lot of family history here. My father, my grandfather, great-grandfather have all farmed here, so no, we're very lucky, really.
But yesterday's budget could change all that. Inheritance tax on farms with over £1 million in assets at an effective rate of 20% would come in from April 2026. This tax relief had allowed small family farms, including buildings like houses, to be handed down the generations. A tradition James said if his daughters Sarah and Martha would like, he would carry on.
I'd love to have the opportunity to potentially hand the farm down to the next generation of my family. And yesterday's budget have put a serious dent on that. We'll effectively be hit with a 20% tax bill, which is completely unsustainable for a family farm. You'll end up with land being sold to pay those bills there. That'll end up being picked up by, I don't know, property developers. You lose the essence of a family farm. You lose the essence of food production, of local food, of British produce. It goes overnight.
The National Farmers Union echoes these concerns, saying the industry is already reeling from extreme weather and fewer subsidies.
It just seems to be a lack of understanding about the role that food and farming plays in our rural communities, the economic growth that we deliver for those rural areas, and being the bedrock of the food industry. It will have a real inflationary impact on the cost of the raw ingredients that we produce, and that will have to be passed through to the consumer.
The Tories say Labour broke a clear promise made to farmers, but today the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has defended her actions.
73% of farms will not be affected at all by the changes that we made yesterday to agricultural property relief. So small farms will see no change in the inheritance tax that they pay as a result of the decisions that we made yesterday.
The farming proposals are really disappointing and very surprising. I've just been speaking to a farmer in my community who is shocked by them. He said when he heard the news, he just put his head in his hands for 10 minutes. These are a tax on family farms, and at a time when farmers have been facing huge uncertainty in the markets, it just feels like a really ill-conceived proposal.
Do you feel a bit betrayed by Sir Keir Starmer?
I do, in respect there. I was fortunate enough to be at the NFU conference, heard Sir Keir talking there, felt quite positive about some of the things he was saying. The fact that he was recognising how important family farms were, how important farming was there, just feels like he's completely rowed back on those comments there.
James does welcome funding for flood mitigation schemes and cash for the agricultural budget, but he does fear that when the day comes and he wants to pass on the farm, difficult decisions will need to be made or possibly sell up entirely, as it's just not worth it. Kieran Fitzpatrick, ITV News.
The new Labour government had pretty much a blank sheet for agricultural policy, but I think a lot of farmers went into this election thinking that things couldn't be any worse, because under the last Conservative administration, things were pretty bad for farming, and they've gone now from the frying pan into the fire with this new Labour government. They have decided to change the inheritance tax rules for farms. In 1992, the Conservative government removed the requirement for inheritance tax from farms because what was happening was that farms were being crashed because they couldn't afford to pay the inheritance tax. And the change that has come with this new government has been sprung on us. It wasn't in their manifesto. There was no mention of it. In fact, Keir Starmer went along to the NFU conference this year and empathised with the whole agony of losing a farm and gave false assurances to farmers.
It seems to bring a new existential risk to British farming. Losing a farm is not like losing any other business. it can't come back. That's why the lack of urgency from the government, the lack of attention to detail, the lack of long-term planning, it's not on. You deserve better.
And as a result, farmers are the most angry I can ever remember because they feel they've been misled and lied to.
Talk to Liz Webster first, an arable farmer and founder of Save British Farming. Liz, great to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed. Is saving British farming going to get a lot harder after what Rachel Reeves announced yesterday, in your view? Afternoon.
Afternoon. Yeah, absolutely. But what I like to try and talk about is what it means for you, everybody, because all of us need to eat. And what does it mean about your food? And, you know, if our family farm system crashes, which this has the potential to do, and we're already looking at family farms, shrinkage over the last couple of decades because of the competition and Brexit. But if you don't get your food from family farms, and it's coming all from mostly imports and factory farming, because factory farming has been increasing a lot since 2016. There's over 200 super mega farms in this country now since then you will have no control over your food, what it's like, how the animals are reared, what the quality of it is. You'll have no say. The same as we have no say over the rivers now and the water, because all of that food will come in from multinational corporations and you'll have no say on that. And that will be the biggest change, really, rather than looking at farmer by farmer and saying, you're lucky because you live in that house. And, it's a very specific industry, farming. And it's in this country. We've done it with cute family farms. We farm very sustainably. And it basically means that will become much, much smaller, much more specialist. And probably only the very mega wealthy will be able to afford to buy food from those types of farms once we shrink right down. We saw this with the coal mines, exactly the same thing. Now the coal industry is actually very, very lucrative. It's privatised. There's some privatised mines here. Going back, everybody got their coal from British Coal pretty much. Now it's mostly imported and there's some small privatised mines. In essence, that is what we are heading to. This delivery of the inheritance tax means that more farms will go out of business quicker.
Why? Just break that down for us, Liz, because the government says the vast majority of smaller farms won't be affected. It's only those worth more than £1 million.
Well,
Let's just to finish the point. Let me just finish the point. Even then, it's 20% tax you pay over £1 million, which people will say, actually, you still get to inherit £1 million tax-free, and then you pay 20%, which is less than most working people.
We've got farms which have been in generations for decades, for centuries, and it means that will end because there is no money in farming, and it's becoming even more difficult because of Brexit mainly, but also the climate is causing a lot of problems. So once you put into this that it's so risky to produce food, the government are not helping us to grow food either. We're being helped to look after the environment. And so it actually means that there will be less farms. And it means that your food is going to be more processed, come in from further away, or it'll come from factories, which you will have no say on. And ultimately, that's what you've got to think about, because the system that we've got has ensured that you've had good food, good quality, and you've had control of, I want to know that it's this and that, and they're not doing this to the animal, and you will have no say. You'll be going into eating food blindfolded, pretty much like they have in the United States. And that is the decision around this, because we've had a system which has been built up since the last war around the need for food security and to produce food in our own country. And it really has come from that. And it will be collapsing because of this. And the other issue is that it sounds like a lot of money, but you go out and look how much a tractor is, how much a combine harvester is. All of these are big, big sums. But when you actually put your food on the shelves, which we're finding it harder because of the Brexit trade barriers and everything else, there is no money in it. It's a charity, really, producing food, largely. And that is what we're up against. So we're already hobbled, and now this is the straw that's going to break the camel's back.
I hear what you're saying.
And it's tragic.
I hear what you're saying completely. But you're sort of making out that all of these farms are going to go under. The government claims, and feel free to dispute this, but the government claims that 3/4 of people inheriting farms, 3/4 of these claims will be unaffected by this change.
Well, the thing is, there's not many farms left. There's many less now than there were 10 years ago. And so if you're looking at recent data in the last 2 or 3 years, not many farmers have died in the last 2 or 3 years because there's not that many of us. And they build up through family farms. So the children work with you as well. It is an actual family business. And that will come to an end. That's why the investment of the child taking on the farm, they've already been giving their labour for probably 2 or 3 decades, 4 decades before they inherit it. That's how the system works, and it's an end of that system.
And I hear you loud and clear on the sort of the practical consequence of this change. Oh, in principle, though, Liz, people will say, well, hold on, that I'm not free to pass down my house. I'm not free to pass out the savings that I've built up. Why should somebody be free to pass down a farm just because their wealth is tied up in that rather than something else?
Yeah,
is it fair?
You've got to remove the personal stuff from it because ultimately,
but it's the principle. It's the principle of
it. Do you want to work on a farm 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, as we do, looking after animals, working really, really hard for no money? It's like a noose around your neck. I mean, we look after these farms because of cherishing the industry and what we do. It's a way of life.
But in that
Not
case,
many
paying
people
20%.
And Jeremy Clarkson is the first to explain this.
But
it is a way of life which the government are now intent on ending. And it means that it will impact your food and our food security in an enormous way because we're so good at doing this. We produce over half of the food in this country. And that will soon end. And then you'll be looking at mostly eating imported food. And that's been increasing anyway.
Interesting.
So this is the direction of travel. So it is about saying, what does it mean to me as a consumer rather than what does it mean for the individual farmer?
Hey, Liz, interesting stuff. Thank you very much, Liz Webster.
And not only that, the government are putting out false information. They're relying on some very narrow data to make out that hardly any farmers will be impacted by this new offensive.
Speak to Charlotte Smith, presenter of the BBC's Farming Today and Countryfile. Thank you so much for joining us, Charlotte. Now, broadly speaking, family farms, until this budget, could be handed down without inheritance tax, but that's no longer the case if they're worth more than £1 million.
That's entirely right. And farmers are using words like betrayal, vindictive, and say that this will be the death of the family farm. Betrayal because the government had ruled this out, but it still appeared in the budget. Now, the government says 70% of farms won't be affected because as well as the £1 million allowance, which you mentioned, if you add in other allowances, the government says that will take most farming businesses to £2 million before inheritance tax kicks in, and they point out that that tax is payable over 10 years. Farmers say that they don't recognise those figures from the Treasury. We've spoken to quite a few agricultural analysts who also don't recognise those figures. They say this will actually catch many farms because when you add in the value of things like buildings and tractors and businesses, because most farmers have diversified into something else so that they can keep going, then you will be faced with a bill in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. And farmers say that to afford that, people will either have to sell the whole farm or sell off land, and that will make the remaining farm less viable. Now, this is of course, a once-in-a-generation expense. It only happens when somebody dies. And as you say, tax experts point out that farmers can get round it. They can, for instance, gift all their land to their children, and as long as they live for 7 years, it's exempt. They could save up for the bill, or they could take out life insurance and borrow money. This is where farmers say people just don't get how farming works. They are asset rich and cash poor. The National Farmers Union says the average return of a working farm in the UK is less than 1%. So they say they simply won't be able to afford this kind of debt.
OK, I mean, and why was it brought in then? Was the intention to stop very rich people buying up farms essentially as an inheritance tax dodge?
Yes, and certainly ministers are very much targeting that, and also say that when they go and see farmers, particularly in beautiful areas of the country, that is something that is always raised. People coming, buying up land and not really being interested in it. They really want the house and the nice view. There is some hope in the government as well, I think, that this might bring land prices down, because if land isn't as attractive to people who aren't really interested in farming, then it might become a little bit cheaper. I should say that part of the anger is the timing of this. We're in the middle of the biggest agricultural transition in a generation, because we're moving away from those direct farm subsidies paid direct into farmers' bank accounts under the old EU system. Now, there are 4 different systems coming in the 4 nations of the UK. But in England, that transition is quite far advanced, and farmers have seen the money they are paid by the government cut by half. In this budget, they've also been told that the pace will be picked up, and they will see next year less money than they have budgeted for, as we move to a completely new system where they are only paid for the good things that they do for the environment, things like improving soils or planting hedgerows. So they're already in quite a turmoil, as it were. Also, we have just had the second wettest winter on record. Numerous farmers I've spoken to have planted crops, invested in them, and seen them literally drown. Then they haven't been able to get onto the land to plant new crops. So it is a really difficult time, and that's why many farmers are saying we're just being kicked when we're down.
Yeah, it really does. It's understandable if many farmers feel like it is the final straw. Charlotte Smith, thank you very much indeed for joining us, presenter of the BBC's Farming Today and Country File.
So they could have brought in an exemption so that only people who are earning at least 80% of their income from farming are exempt from inheritance tax, rather than going for the value of the farm itself, the land, its buildings, and also, your machinery and your livestock and everything that you have as a farmer.
Andrew Ward, who's an arable farmer in Lincolnshire. Thanks so much for joining us, Andrew. How are the changes in the budget going to affect you?
Hello, Tina. Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. First of all, Charlotte was absolutely bang on in everything she said. It was a very, very good sum up, really. And I think, yes, it absolutely is a catastrophic budget for agriculture and farming and maintaining family farms, because when you look at the generational way that farms carry on and that they've been handed down from generation to generation, it's only been possible because of the tax exemptions. And obviously, as well, it's beneficial because it means we can produce British healthy food rather than rely on inferior foreign imports. So it is a catastrophic day and a catastrophic week for British agriculture.
Well, Andrew, yesterday we had the Health Secretary on Wes Streeting, and I asked him to defend his decision. Here was his answer.
I just sort of say to people that firstly, that will only apply where the value is more than £1 million. That even where that's the case, inheritance tax is charged at a lower rate for farmers than for others. In terms of current claimants, 3/4 wouldn't see any change. That gives you a sense of the scale of who's affected. Okay. And for those that are affected, the repayment period is 10 years. And of course, people, when they're handing on assets to the next generation, these aren't just kind of property assets. These are obviously business assets. So we'd hope people will be able to pay that back over time.
So essentially 3/4 won't be affected. You get to pay a lower rate anyway, and over 10 years. What's your reaction to that?
Ludicrous. I don't know who it is who's advised the government. First of all, to say the vast majority of farms won't be affected is simply not true. In Lincolnshire, where we are, I produce wheat, barley, sugar beet, all the normal sort of crops. And Lincolnshire produces about a third of the total vegetables for the country, and it's a big producer of food across the UK. I don't know any farms that are of the size that he's talking about that are worth £1 million or less. £1 million will get you your farmhouse and probably 20, 30, 40 acres, and that will be it. And that will get you £1 million. The average size of a UK farm is 217 acres, right. The average. And that means 2.17 million value if you look at it at £10,000 an acre. So who has advised the government to say that we need to set this limit at £1 million? I don't know. It just shows how out of touch they are.
Yeah.
But Tina, I think one thing it does do, it really highlights now to us that we are under no illusions that this government does not want to support British agriculture and British food, and it is quite happy to allow farms to go to the wall and import food from abroad that, again, Tina, will impact on the National Health Service, because a lot of the food abroad is produced to lower standards than we have here, and all that will do is make the National Health Service even busier than they are when the government are saying they want to fix it.
And so what would you then say to someone listening who says, well, look, if you've got assets of that size worth over £2 million, then you also have options of how to pay that inheritance tax bill?
Yes, there are, but the options are you still need profit. You still need finances available to pay that. And yes, we've just heard you can do it over 10 years. But the problem is the interest rates, obviously that impacts on it as well. And all farmers, we don't own land. We're just nurturing it, and we are just custodians of that block of land for the next generation. And at the minute, it's looking like a lot of farmers can't afford to die.
All right, Andrew, thank you.
The numbers in farming are frightening. They're huge. And it's really difficult for people who are not in farming to understand that. But bills that we have to shoulder have gone up between 40 and 50% since the Ukraine invasion and Brexit. And we have lost subsidies. We've got more competition with cheaper imports coming in. And now we have a government that is saying that when we die, you basically have to give your farm more or less to the government, because many farmers are actually in debt, or they're having to borrow money to expand, diversify, to survive. So this is really, really bad news for farming. And it's exceptionally sore because Keir Starmer has misled farmers. And not only that, Steve Reed's earlier assurances about what they were going to do and how marvellous it was going to be for farming have also been misleading, because this has been sprung on us from nowhere, despite the fact that they promised they wouldn't do it.
Madam Deputy Speaker, farmers do a fantastic job for our country. They produce the food we eat. They steward our beautiful countryside. They deserve our support, but the previous government let them down. Our New Deal for farming will offer farmers a fresh start. Action to cut energy bills, action on rural crime, action to open markets to trade and to export, action to cut the appalling levels of mental ill health that affect farmers right across our country. I welcome this debate and the chance to restate this government's support for farmers. After 14 years of failure, change has begun.
And as a result, there's going to be a lot of backlash from farmers and the rural communities, and it is going to give a lot of weight to Keir Starmer's, the Labour's opposition, and it's not good for his popularity. But what I always try to impress upon people is, instead of it being about individual farmers, what this is about is our food. Because if our family farms collapse, then what will replace them? And it is the case that since 2016, there have been more than 200 mega factories opening in Britain. And the truth is that to ensure food security, if we collapse our family farm system, it will mean a collection of more factory farms mixed together with more imports from the other side of the world, which are reared to very, very low standards. They're bad for public health. And then that means that our health system bears the strain of it, as well as families bear the strain of having unhealthy people in their family because of their diet and what they're consuming. They have no control over what goes into this food and how the animals are reared. At the moment, you have a system where if you're unhappy with the way animals are kept, people can lobby, and through the farm assurance scheme, standards have ramped up over the years because of that organic relationship between consumers and the government and the way the system has existed. So if you go into a system where everything is in factories or it's all come in from abroad, it will be a complete loss of control. The same as we have over the standard and the mess in our rivers. You can moan about it, you can protest about it, but there's been nothing you can do about it. And that is exactly what the American food system is like. There's plenty of people that are upset about the food they're forced to eat, but there is nothing they can do to change it. And that is where we are walking into or running into blindfolded because politicians are not telling the truth. For this country, the reason that it looks the way it looks is because we farmed the same way for thousands of years. And if we give up most of our family farms, the country is not going to look the same. And that is very sad. It's also really bad for biodiversity. It's also really bad for the climate. And so I do hope that this government listen to farmers and rural voters and anyone who is interested in having good, healthy food and a nice countryside, and U-turn on this really bad decision.
Southwest, where around a third of the nation's livestock is bred, around £750,000 worth of business took place here today in dairy cattle trading.
The auction ring is a site that hasn't really changed for decades, apart, of course, from the prices. And the farmers right now say everything needs to be done to maintain their incomes.
Many here have been farming for generations.
What do you think the government should do to help?
Keep milk price good is what they should do. Because without that, then there's going to be no farmers left, is there? Because, well, everyone knows it's getting less and less.
Yeah.
It's a pretty sorry state, really, isn't it?
The main thing is the agricultural relief on farms, and if that's done away with, you're going to see generations of farms that are just going to have to sink, because the younger generation now will not be able to foot that 40%. They will, and years of farming will be gone.
Every country should be producing as much as possible to feed their country. And I reckon England could be producing up to 80%. But I reckon we're more like 45%. They say about 55%, but I reckon there's less. We are in a very poor, very vulnerable situation.
The buildings here were part funded by the government when they were opened in 2015. Farmers say it's essential that ministers stick with them and listen to their real concerns. Richard Lawrence, ITV News, Holsworthy.
And you. Andrew's in Redhill on Surrey on this. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Ben.
Your thoughts? You're a farmer.
Yeah, that's right. I'm just, I supported a lot of what Liz was saying in your earlier caller. And I think farming will be, going down the same route as the miners did in the way the government are handling food security in this country. But the fact that you said on air that, everyone would be happy to receive £1 million tax-free is not in context with the real picture in the value of a farm. If you're going to be a viable commercial farm, you've got to be farming 200 to 300 acres plus. And the market value can be anywhere between 2.5 to 3 million quid, possibly north of that, depending where you are in the country. So the percentage you're talking about, 20% of that, maybe £2 million is a whole different picture to 20% of £1 million. My point is, I think the threshold should have been made higher to protect the small family farms and maybe go for the bigger farms. But whichever way it is, it's, what you're saying is not in context, I think, with the current farming picture.
The context being that an awful lot of farms are, by nature of what they are, Andrew, worth more than £1 million. Yeah. It's not just the sort of, right. It's not the super elite, big, wealthy farmers. It's your average kind of day-to-day family farm.
Yeah, your family-run farms, maybe milking a couple of hundred cows, maybe got 150
The point I was making was, if you compare not just to other farms, but you compare to most people aren't inheriting wealth of more than £1 million, let alone 2 or 3, whether that's property, whether that's savings, whether that's a business, whether it's a farm. If you are inheriting £3 million worth of wealth, even if that's tied up in land and agricultural sort of resources, you're still inheriting an awful lot more money than most people would. And that's why a lot of people say, well, you're still the wealthiest few percent. It's right that you're taxed.
Well, that's fine. If you could make a decent return out of the income you make out of farming, then if you were to borrow money to pay that tax bill, then it would be, I think you might have a point. But at the moment, margins are so small in farming, in farming circles, whatever aspect you're in, whether it be milk, beef, or sheep, or arable, it's just the margins in the industry are not there to substantiate that sort of borrowing if you're going to pay a tax bill.
Which means sorry, Andrew, to jump in there. Are you saying that most people who are going to be hit with that tax would have to sell, if not the whole farm, then at least some of it to pay the tax?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So Liz has had a point. The farms will get smaller. The smaller family farms will disappear. And they are the majority of, I would say, the backbone of food produced in this country. And we're penalising them to the point of destruction. And, I think it's about... I think it's a big mistake what they've done. The threshold should have been lifted to help. Where would
you have set it?
Oh, I would think possibly around a £2 or £3 million mark.
But people will say to that, well, hold on, I've got a £3 million house, or I've got £3 million of shares, I've got £3 million of savings, and my children are going to have to pay an awful lot of tax on that. Why should your children not have to pay tax on it just because it's not shares or savings, but it's land, Andrew? Do you see what I mean? I hear
what you're saying. But what I'll say to you is that those small family farms are producing food in this country to put food on the table that is sustainable and traceable and conforms with everything that the consumer wants.
There's a social good. There's a social benefit that you don't get if someone's just passing down shares or property.
Yeah, there's that. And if people disappear out of the countryside that are working the countryside, there's a knock-on effect to all the allied industries within farming. The engineers, the equipment companies, etc. All of that will fall by the wayside. There's been no forethought put into the knock-on effects of what
it does feel like that, Andrew. It does feel like the decision was made in principle, and in principle I support it. But in practice, when you hear from you and Liz about the actual impact on it, alarm bells do start ringing, to be honest with you. Andrew, thank you very much indeed for spelling that out for us.